Hello and welcome to My R&R Hat. As an entrepreneur, you have many hats to wear, and the My Hat series gives you a snippet of information, a place to learn some tips and strategies for the many tasks you must master as the business owner. So grab a coffee and let's get started. Today, we welcome Sherri Flavel from Community Futures Fraser Fort George's very own expert in human resources. Sherri has been with CF for 8 years and has education and experience as an HR manager. So welcome, Sherri.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So we're going to jump right in. So as an expert in HR management, what could a business owner consider if they're struggling with hiring employees?
You ask a really great question there, Elizabeth. So we'll just jump right into the PowerPoint presentation.
All right, I'm going to share that right now. Here we go.
Awesome. So you might ask, why are we talking about this today? And one of the things that's currently happening in our business environment is what we call a tight labor market. So as many business owners have experienced, there's a high demand for labor and a really low supply. So this has created some challenges for small business owners, especially. So small business owners, when facing this challenge, they might start to consider different options. And so today what we're going to talk about is the option of hiring a self-employed worker, entering into a contract with them, over hiring an employee for your business.
All right, excellent. So you're going to go through now then the key differences between employee and self-employed worker?
Yep, that's right.
Excellent.
So we're going to first start by talking about an employer-employee relationship. So this is the one that we're most often familiar with. So when we look at this relationship, we identify the payee as the employer, and the worker is considered the employee. Now, the employer will deduct CPP, EI, and income tax from that employee's pay or remuneration, and the employer will remit it on behalf of the employee along with their own share of the deductions. So they submit that to the CRA, so Canada Revenue Agency. So if the employer does not make the remittance, then they could be subject to a penalty. Now, next slide. When we look at what is a self-employed worker relationship, we identify that the self-employed individual operates a business and is engaged in a business relationship with the payer. So we're looking at what's a business-to-business relationship here. And just as a side note, self-employed workers can also apply and be eligible for paying employment insurance special benefits themselves.
Oh, I see. Okay. So why do these differences matter to a small business owner who needs somebody to work for them?
That's a really good question. So let's look at the next slide. So a self-employed worker could challenge their relationship status with the Canada Revenue Agency by June 29th of a following year. So what that means is they might say, although I was hired by contract as a self-employed worker, I was treated as an employee. So the CRA can be asked by the employee or the self-employed worker or the employer for a ruling on identifying what the relationship is. So if it is found that the employee-employer relationship is identified, then the employer could be required to pay both the employees and the employer's share of the contribution and premiums that were owing that were not paid during the term of the contract. And they could also be subject to paying penalties and interest on that as well. They could, it could be appealed, but after appeal, the decision is final.
Okay, so really important to keep those boundaries clear as to what their role is.
Yes, that's exactly right, because it could have a very, a financial impact on the business owner.
Excellent.
So when the Canada Revenue Agency is asked for a ruling, they look at several different factors. So we're going to take a look at those factors. So all of these factors don't have to be aligned, but each of them is considered when the CRA is making a ruling. So how they differentiate, they look at the differentiation and they try to identify what indeed the relationship was. So when it comes to the relationship status, if the worker is an employee, then what they do is they look at the employer contract and they identify it. Is this a contract of service related to an employer and employee relationship? Or if they see that the contract is actually a contract for service, it is related more to the business relationship, which would be for a self-employed worker.
All right.
So the next thing that they look at, if you go to the next slide.
Next slide.
So they look at control. So they look at they take a look at the different relationships and they identify where the control in the relationship is. So if it is an employee relationship, there will be a certain amount of subordination that will be that would be there. So the control would be over the employer would have control over the worker on the method that they do their work. The payer decides on the job and has the final word. So they're directing the work of the employee. The payer controls the worker's time. So they identify this is when you start work, this is when you end work. And then the worker would also receive training and direction. So that would be the obligation of the payer in the employee relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. So when it is a contracted self-employed worker, the work is done independently. The self-employed worker oversees their own activities and they have the freedom to work when and for whom they want. So they can even have more than one payer, or they can be working on more than one contract at any given time. And they can accept or refuse work from the business, from the payer. And it is not a subordinate relationship. It's much less subordinate than the employee-employer relationship.
Okay, I see. So
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. So the next area that we'll look at, that the CRA would look at when they're making their ruling, is what's happening with the tools and equipment. So if it's an employee-employer relationship, then what they would identify is, the employer is supplying, maintaining, and repairing the tools for the employee. In those cases, they also have the right to use the employees, so they could the tools, so they can take them and redistribute them amongst their other employees. They have control over the worker's time when using the tools, and the worker can also receive that direction and that training on using the tools. Whereas when we look at a self-employed worker, the self-employed worker themselves, the business supplies their own tools, they insure them and they maintain them. They have the right to use them for other jobs as well as for the payer. And then the worker also supplies their own workspace and they maintain and do their own, a substantial amount of the work from their own site. So they don't have a designated place at the employer's place of employment.
Excellent. Next one. Oh, did it not change?
Yep. So the next area area we would look at is like subcontracting work or hiring assistants. So an employee, when they're working for the employer or the payer, they do not have the authority to hire other employees to help them and support their work. So so the worker personally does the work themselves that's designated to them. When we look at a self-employed worker, that worker has more freedoms. So they may not carry out the work personally themselves. They may actually hire somebody to do the work, or they could have another self-employed worker do the work under another contract. So they have the authority to hire and pay costs related to doing the work.
So as a self-employed person, you could actually hire yourself an assistant to help you with that. Whereas as an employee, it'd be like, no.
Yeah, you would require your employer's authority to do that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Huh. Interesting. All right. Next.
So the other factor to consider is financial risk. So who's taking the risk? So that's what the CRA is going to be looking at when they're making the rulings. So one of the things that they're going to look at is when they look at the employee relationship, the employee is not responsible for the operating expenses. That that responsibility falls on the employer. The relationship with the payer is generally continuous. So they get hired on, they have an employment contract, it's ongoing. The employees are not financially liable for work obligations. So if they make an error or omission or something happens in their work project, they're not liable for it. It's the employer who would be liable for that. And then the payer also controls the method and amount of pay. So they're the ones who are making the payroll, paying the clients. They have all the control over that. When we look at the self-employed worker, so they have the authority to hire and pay for helpers. They are hired, generally speaking, they're hired for a specific job. It's not ongoing. So it's usually some sort of a contract work with a start and end period. And the self-employed worker is financially liable to fulfill their obligations. And so they would have their own liability insurance in place. They do not receive protection or benefits from the payer. So they have to, follow the terms of the contract and be liable for the work that they do. And they can advertise and actively market their services to other payers as well.
All right. Excellent.
Okay, so the other area to look at is investment and management. So when we look at an employee-employer relationship, there's no capital investment in the payer's business. So that employee does not have an investment that they've made financially into the business. They do not have like the business presence that the employer would have. But when we look at a self-employed worker, they invest capital in their own business. They manage their own staff and they hire and pay others, and they establish a business presence. So they are independent.
Just an entrepreneur of themselves.
That's right.
Excellent.
Now, the opportunity for profit. So when the CRA is considering their ruling, this is another area that they will look at. So when they look at the employer-employee relationship, they will look to see if it's not in the position to realize a profit or loss. So the employee, cannot realize the profit or loss. So that's not their area of responsibility. They're entitled to benefit plans normally offered only to employees. So that's, one of the areas that that really helps them to identify if the relationship is employee or self-employed worker. So the self-employed worker, they can hire and pay a substitute to fulfill the contract of the work to the payer. And they are compensated by a flat fee that incurs expenses for the work services. So, often the work service expenses will be included in the contract work that they're doing. And the self-employed worker will compensate themselves out of the pay. So they're not on payroll. Yeah.
Right. They're not on payroll. That makes perfect sense. So what recommendations do you make to a small business owner when they're considering hiring an employee versus a self-employed worker?
Well, let's take a look at the next slide there. So what I would really encourage any business owner who is considering a self-employed worker over an employee to really have a good visit at the CRA's website and really learn and understand the differences between treating the payer as an employee or as a self-employed worker. So there's really good information. All of the information that I'm sharing today is taken directly from the CRA website. Now, if a small business owner might feel a sense of confusion, they can also consult with an HR consultant. So it might be a good investment for them to reach out and consult, because they don't, in the end, they don't want to have to pay, those penalties or to have to repay EI benefits and CPP payments that they were not expecting to have to pay. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. And looking back over these points, they could kind of do check in which column to kind of give them an idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you can just use it just like how am I treating this person, and use those as guidelines for how you move forward with the person that's doing the work for your business.
Right. Awesome. So I know personally, digital marketing is definitely an example of a job that a business owner might contract out to a self-employed worker instead of hiring an employee. So what are some other examples?
Yeah, there's lots of different examples because, obviously each business is different. So it could be outsourcing things like even your HR experts, your bookkeeper, your accounting, all of those sort of outsourced work that you can have done for your business. But it can also include, like, it's very common in construction or trades, because it really helps the business be able to grow with the need and then shrink back down. So, it really helps them to scale up or down if they can choose to, do the self-employed workers over an employee. So that's when it would work really good. Anytime a business needs to scale up, but they, are also intending to scale down, it can help them save on things like not having to, hire, not having to purchase equipment. So they can look at different ways to manage those expenses in a more efficient way with a self-employed worker.
Excellent. I'm just going to stop sharing here. There we go. Well, Sherri, you have provided the PowerPoint presentation referencing the CRA website, which will be downloadable here for anybody who would like it. Really great stuff here, Sherri. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. All the best to the businesses.
Thanks. Have a great day.